Please pray with me. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts, our reflections across the day, the conversations we have around this service, our actions, the places where we think we see you, may they be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I don't see everything from up here, but I may see more than you do from down there. It's a different perspective anyhow, isn't it? So I see two daughters of this church here today, both of whom grew up and moved away to other places, but they're present here in worship this morning. And it warms my heart to have Tricia Burt here and Jennifer Hammondtree here. Welcome. It's good to have you both home and back in this congregation even for a Sunday. In the Gospel of John, I think we start in this passage in the 9th chapter with two assumptions I want to point out for you. John, the Apostle John, the writers of the Gospel of John, they assume when they say the phrase, the Jews, you understand that they're talking about the religious leaders, all right? They assume that you understand that's the distinction they're making. When they say the Jews, they mean the religious leaders. So they're talking about people like John Ryder, all right, or Nicole, all right, or Loli, all right, or maybe me, or the choir. You all are leaders, right? Or maybe you all, because here you are at 11 o'clock on a Sunday. All right, so when John says the Jews, he's assuming that you understand they mean the religious leaders. Remember, everybody in this story is Jewish. The blind man, the parrots, the Pharisees, Jesus. So everybody in the story is Jewish. They're talking about the religious leaders here. Second assumption, when John uses the word signs, John's talking about miracles. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, every time there's a miracle, something that Jesus does that is different than the laws of nature, like feeding 5,000 with just a little bread and 2 fish, when walking on water. When those happen in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the same word in Greek is used every time, and they're called miracles. But in John's gospel, when that happens, John uses a different word, and the word is signs. John sees these as signs that we're given to see the true reality of Jesus, that God's kingdom is breaking in and that Jesus is the Son of God. And classically, there are 7 signs that John lifts up as we walk through the life of Jesus. The changing of the water into wine, the healing of a royal official's son, the healing of the paralyzed person at the pool, the feeding of the 5,000 with fish and loaves, walking on water. That was a sign. Did you see that? That might be something you want to pay attention to, telling you that Jesus is different. The healing of a man born blind, today's story. And finally, the 7th sign that we're going to get is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. John's asking along the way, did you see this? And what is telling us about who Jesus is? Part of the work of Christians, part of my work, part of your work, is to point out to one another, to the community, to the world around us, the signs of where we see God's kingdom breaking in. Pointing out signs of Christ present with us. And when we do that, it nurtures hope. When you point out signs, it nurtures hope in others around you. So where do you catch a glimpse of the kingdom becoming visible? This afternoon. Today, before you lay your head down for sleep. Where do you see Christ at work, signs of Christ's presence? Others may just see their moments, but they may not have faith. But in seeing the same moment, you, from the context of faith, may see Christ present with us, or the kingdom breaking in. Can you list any today? I asked the children to make a list. You make a list too. For Pete's sake, give me one. One, all right, before you go to bed tonight. One place where maybe you saw the kingdom breaking in. What if today we focused on our own list? Now, a word about Jesus as healer. And when Jesus takes his own saliva and dirt and makes a salve and rubs it on the eyes of a blind man and heals him, I want to acknowledge that's a mystery. Not only is it a miracle, but why he uses spit and mud to do that, that's a mystery too, all right? We don't know the details of his specific healing technique here. There is interesting first century Palestinian records of other places where healers used saliva and mud as a salve on people's eyes. And for that matter, I bet some of you, like me, have had the experience of a grandmother when you were a boy and you walked by and said, "Come over here for a minute," grabbed you, pulled you over and rubbed your eye. Did you? Were you healed that way? Yesterday, I heard another grandfather on the playground with some small children. When a grandson fell off the slide, he ran over to him and said, "I fell off the slide and hit my leg, Grandpa." And the grandfather said to him, "Let me look at that. Rub some dirt on it." That's what he said. Now, I'm aware that that's not actually healing, but a distraction. That's what's taking place there. But we're still using language in a similar way. I do think that this story is one of many in the Gospels that teach us, irrefutably teaches us, that Jesus cared deeply about physical illness and healing. There's a direct connection between Jesus of Nazareth, the great physician, and the work that doctors, nurses, dentists, public health officials, therapists, all of the healthcare professionals that we know, there's a direct connection between their work and the practice of healing in the pattern of Jesus Christ. But it will take more than mud and saliva to open the eyes of the religious leaders, the Pharisees, in this story. They can't see the blessing even in the moment of it. Did you pick that up? I mean, a man who was born blind suddenly can see, and the only thing they can see is that their deep-seated conviction that you shouldn't heal, work on the Sabbath, has been violated. They're missing the miracle because of the assumption and the premise that they bring to the moment. This poor fellow, he persists in his testimony that Jesus touched his eyes and now he sees. He persists even as they implore him, even as the religious leaders exhort him to tell them that there was something suspicious about Jesus and what he did. They beseech him to tell them that in some way he knows that Jesus is a sinner just like they do too. He persists. God bless him. Come on, they say. You know he's a sinner. Tell us that he's a sinner too. If I was him under this kind of pressure, by about the third time, I'd be saying, you know, come to think of it, maybe he was a sinner also. But they're not able to give up on their own assumptions. Deep within them, maybe they inherited it. Deep within them is the conviction that if someone is really suffering, it must be because they're a sinner. It's right up front in the text, verse 1. As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. Verse 2, his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" You see the assumption? If he's blind, if he's suffering, it must be because he was a sinner. And Jesus answers directly, right up front, the next verse. Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him." He's not simply a sinner because he's suffering, or because he's poor, or oppressed. I told you earlier that we have these gospel stories. I'm thinking that we have these gospel stories, especially in John, these extended stories that we're getting about certain people, because people in the Christian community around John, people came to know these people in the stories. They began to know, even after the death and the resurrection of Jesus, Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman, the blind man. I've been going with the thesis that one of the reasons in John's Gospels that we have these detailed accounts of the people who were involved with these people is because they knew them. They saw the people at the wedding where the water was turned into wine. They knew as a part of their continuing community the woman at the well. They knew Nicodemus. They became a part of the community around the Apostle John, and as they shared their stories, and they were asked again, tell us that story again, those stories became memories, extended memories of Jesus, extended discourses with them, and they became precious memories. Precious memories. Our memory as well now. So I've been telling you that's one of the reasons why I think we have these stories. These stories where Jesus has a conversation with someone and sometimes nobody else is present but the two people. But now here's a second reason why I think we have them. In this particular story, did you notice where Jesus is in the story? He's at the beginning and at the end. That's the two places where he shows up. And in the middle, he's not there at all, except in the power of what he did in the healing and how it impacts them. Where is Jesus in this story? He's at the beginning and at the end, and in the power of his work as they remembered it in the middle. I think they have the story because it was a mirror for them of the way they were living, where they had Jesus present with them at the beginning in the gospel stories, and at the end, as they hope for Jesus and the kingdom to come, his presence and his return and their life with him together. But they're living in the middle, in between, which is where you're living. In between Jesus and the Gospels and Jesus and the kingdom to come. And I think this story helped them, was a guide for them, because it's hard, it's often hard, living in the middle. It's hard if you're living in that space between Jesus present and Jesus still to come. It's hard often living where you are. It's not always the case that when we are faithful, good things happen to us. Sometimes when we think we're doing the right thing, even when we think we're doing the right thing, that's the hardest struggle. I mean, that's my own experience, and I'm surprised by it. But sometimes, when after my most careful discernment, and I may not have 100% knowledge, but I pray and I make the best judgment I can, and I'm seeking to be faithful. Sometimes, you understand what I'm talking about, John? Sometimes that's when the hardest struggle takes place. It's hard to do what you think is the right thing in those moments. It would often be so much easier to just go along. Ask the blind man. Yeah, now that I think about it, he must have been a sinner. But he doesn't say that. Do you think that these religious leaders, do you think that these Pharisees forgive this blind man for his endorsement of Jesus? Even after he sees? It doesn't seem like it to me. When they crucified Jesus, I bet they were looking to round up this guy too. Like this story, we live in the mystery between the times of Jesus present with us and the times of the kingdom coming. And how do we live? That's part of what this story is teaching us. That's why it's a precious memory, because it's an example story, a paradigm. How do we live in the in-between time? We work to heal. We speak the truth. We persevere, even under duress. We report the signs we see, even when we do not fully understand them. One thing I know, he says, I was blind, but now I see. Rowan Williams was the Archbishop of Canterbury a number of years ago, about 13 years ago now. He wrote a book called On Being Christian. He's an excellent writer, and his books have been a significant influence on a great deal of Christian thought around the world. But in this particular book, he talks about how discipleship is practicing awareness, living in the time in betweens. It's a work of being aware and practicing being sensitive to what God is doing around us, practicing trying to not miss Jesus Christ present with us, and living in that moment, and that's the work of it. Living in that moment includes living with a kind of expectancy that we're going to see God breaking in somewhere. And that's a characteristic then of disciples. We're people who expect we just might see God breaking in the world somewhere today. We take it for granted that there's always something about the breakthrough that the master, the teacher, is going to show us, something out of the ordinary that's going to put a new light on the landscape. And Rowan Williams says that awareness is kind of like bird watching. Have you read this, Bob? He says it's kind of like bird watching. The experienced bird watcher knows that you have to go be still, that you have to be poised, alert, not tense or fussy, but knowing that you're in a place where the extraordinary might just happen, so keep your eyes open and your ears open too. I love that image of the Christian life as bird watching. You sit very still because something's liable to break into view, and sometimes it may mean that you sit a long day out in the rain, nothing much happens. But on a specific occasion, suddenly it lights in front of you, and there it is. There you see it. God is doing the unexpected in the midst of the ordinary. The poet T.S. Eliot describes it as the peripheral glance of light on a kingfisher's wings as he slides along the water when you see him out of the side of your eyes, and that makes it all worthwhile. John's gospel presents us with a steady accumulation of moments of recognition like that, where they see the signs, and where we see the signs too. We see the glory that God is placing in the world and around Jesus Christ, and they begin to understand. And for us today, we trying to be Christ's disciples, we're called to live with that kind of awareness and expectancy, looking for signs of the kingdom breaking in and pointing it out to others. That's your work. That's our call. All right? I said bird watching. It might be fishing. All right? It might be shell gathering. Anything where you're doing work in the ordinary, maybe watching small children, but you keep awareness going that the miraculous might be happening amongst us here. Now, we're not precisely where the first disciples are. We're post-resurrection believers, and so we ought to be able to understand a little more than them, wouldn't you think? In theory, at least. After all, we have the Holy Spirit to direct us and point our heads sometimes. And like those first disciples, we look, we listen, we watch with expectancy the world that we live in, that we might point out signs to others. We look for signs of healing, the signs of Christ's presence with us, and with persistence, we point them out to others because it nurtures hope. It develops faithfulness. It pursues healing. Jesus said, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world.